Welcome to the study on the authenticity of Matthew. This is the second part of the introduction to the Gospel of Matthew, also known in Hebrew as Beserot Matai. And we're going to be looking at right now a couple of things, a couple of issues before we actually get into the actual manuscript of the Gospel of Matthew. As we saw last week in our class, one of the things that we notice is that Matthew, the reason we're studying Matthew, because according to Eusebius, this was originally written in Hebrew. And as I mentioned last week, one of the biggest problems that we have is we actually don't have an actual original of the Gospel of Matthew, as mentioned by the Church Father, and this causes all types of problems. Of course, George Howard from the University of Mercer wrote an incredible book called The Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, and has catapulted into, you might say, the theological and missionary world in an incredible way. It was written back in 1995, and what he did was an incredible work, and I have to give a lot of credit to the work and the time that was spent in there. But one of the things that we need to realize is that there was a tradition, and there's a tradition, that the witnesses as to this edition is something that we will also be presenting in this whole entire study. And I'm using this one because this is based on the Eben Bochen, which was a manuscript made available to us, as a matter of fact, by the British Library. And he does an incredible work in showing the dating and the witnesses that were used. As he says here, that all the manuscripts date between the 15th and 17th century and are written in various types of script. The best manuscripts of the lot is the British Library, in which he mentions this in the manuscript 26964. This you'll find in his introduction of the book, the Gospel of Matthew Hebrew. He also has catalogized a lot of the issues there, making comparisons of each particular manuscript. So it's an incredible book to have in your collection, those of you who are Christian Bible students, pastors, laymen, because it has the Hebrew and the different manuscripts. He ascribes to it as he studies this and makes a parallel study with this by putting the text and the translations together. Now, the translation is a little bit wanting, but nonetheless it's good enough so you understand the whole entire flow of the message. One thing you will walk away with from reading these manuscripts, in particular the one that supposedly is a translation and attempts to be faithful to the Hebrew without being awkward, is that the rough style of Hebrew, however, is reflected in the English more than ever. And he does make mention that in the beginning. But there is a couple of other things that is kind of misleading when you read the book. The first thing that's misleading, as we see, is, and I'm going to show that again, is that there's an assumption that these manuscripts are originally written from the original Hebrew or a previous Hebrew text. That is completely a fallacy in his whole entire assumption, because as we're going to show, that in fact it's just the opposite, which is true. That in fact this entire manuscripts, or these copies of the manuscripts, were written based on a translation of an earlier edition of the Greek. So we still have now the problem is, what do we do with this? The present edition aims, from his point of view, at the Shem Tov Hebrew Matthew and a more complete evaluation of the Shem Tov tradition. Now, of course, Ibn Shaprut is known as also Shem Tov, and we get this from this different things. There are including errors and inconsistencies in these manuscripts and grammars of each of these manuscripts. Not that I say so, he says so, and he cites the different variations and errors in them. Variant readings are also noted in critical apparatus, and he also makes the present text comes to with errors, spelling, inconsistency, grammar problems, a whole bunch of issues that is not present in there. But one thing you will find is that in this translation, you will see that it is reliable in the sense that it was from a translation of an earlier Greek text or copy of the text. And this will show as we go along, when we actually go plunge into the Gospel of Matthew. And it's very important to notice this, because as we get into this material, we need to know exactly what we're getting into. Now, this is why we say when we get into the actual text, we're actually looking at the actual manuscripts, of the various manuscripts that we're dealing with, be they the Textus Receptus or any of the other texts that's utilized to make translations from, most of which are from the Textus Receptus, which there's a lot of problems because it's much earlier text. Now, when we start with the least problematic through the more disturbing issues, it's really concerning the areas of the Greek New Testament, the Greek language in particular, as far as to the dating of the different manuscripts. As I said from the very beginning, and this, my dear pastor friends or Christian theologians or laymen, you can ask any of your Christian scholars whether or not we have in fact in possession in a Greek original or an original of the Gospel of Matthew or of any of the Gospels. So this is the big problem that the Christendom has to deal with from day one, and that the fact that there is no original manuscript. All that lies before us, like I mentioned in the first clip, is copies of copies of copies, to such an extent that by the 4th century, as I cited in my last video, Ignatius responds to those in the Church of Philadelphia that were complaining that all they had before them were corrupted copies of the archives of the so-said originals, and they weren't originals, they were copies. So obviously this is a problem that started way early in the early church, with the issues of not only problems with punctuation, but actual changes in the actual manuscripts. And interesting enough, one of the Christian scholars that we're going to be looking at, who I will be quoting a lot, is a professor, emeritus professor from the University of Princeton, who already passed away, and his name is Dr. Bruce Metzger, who has written largely on the actual manuscripts of the New Testament, its transmission, its corruption, and its, I would call it, attempt to restore it to somehow readability. And in his book, titled that, The Text of the New Testament, Its Transmission, Corruption, and Restoration, he begins starting with the whole making of the ancient books. Later, he goes into the important witnesses of the text of the New Testament, such as the Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, the papyries, the uncials, the minuscules, and other noteworthy manuscripts that were preserved, and we're going to be taking a look at them very briefly. And some of the ancient versions or translations into other languages, as the Syriac, as the Latin, as the Coptic, the Gothic, the Armenian, the Georgian, the Ethiopic, the Old Slavonic, and other ancient versions of what was a translation. And don't forget that word, translation. These are not original copies. These are translation of what they were relying on, whether it would be a Greek text or whether it be some other form of language that they were utilizing, sometimes Latin and sometimes a combination of Latin utilizing Hebraic words as well. And we're going to also look at the pre-crucial period, the origin and dominance of the Textus Receptus and the problems this belongs, the modern problems of criticism, and the application of the textual criticism to the text of the New Testament in particular. The original textual criticism by scholarly discipline is one that has been highly criticized by more conservative Christian scholars, because it leaves out the notion that there is any errors whatsoever. So the issue of inerrancy is something that scholars realize is a major issue, at least the conservative Christian scholar, and thus they battle this issue because it becomes an issue of faith and not so much an issue of what's before them. Let me give you some ideas of what I mean by that, just drawing on that. There are causes for errors in the transmission in the copies of the New Testament texts, such as, for example, unintentional changes, errors arising from faulty eyesight. Sometimes the scribe would not see properly and would accidentally make a double copy or double word, or perhaps remove words or add things that weren't even not in that same line. Errors arising from faulty hearing. There is errors of the mind, trying to remember things as it was said previously as they were copying it. There are also intentional changes. All this, by the way, is mentioned in the book of Bruce Metzger, involving spelling and grammar, trying to harmonize the text and therefore adding passages into the manuscripts that weren't there originally, thereby corrupting the actual manuscripts, adding additions of natural complements and similar adjuncts, clearing up history. In other words, trying to justify the difficulties that were raised in the actual manuscripts by trying to clear it up or explain it in commentary form, conflations of reading, alterations made because of doctrinal consideration. In other words, is this what we really want the people to believe? And therefore, you see the hand of the theological motivation of changing the passages in the manuscripts. Addition to miscellaneous details in the manuscripts. And this is just only a few of the bit of the problems that we're going to begin to see. Regarding punctuation of text, one of the things that once the translators have decided which form of text to translate, whether the Greek words cause problems arising in punctuation. In antiquity, it was a custom, for example, to write certain words with few words and explain the whole entire concept. And later, this was added and became more expounded. And we're going to see that this happened on a very frequent basis. But let's go first into how these translations came into being. They came to being as a result of the idea of copying for the different communities. So thus, we have a situation here where, let's say you had a copy of a Greek manuscript, and the community really didn't have that manuscript in the language of the people. So what they did is actually copied it, and they had scribes, not always professionals in their trade, and they would copy it as they saw best to translate it. Some copies were very, very good, others not so very, very good, and thus you had a whole bunch of problems regarding this. And this is why looking at the copies will give you an indication also what text they possibly use. And this is why when we get into what we're looking at, we have a whole bunch of problems. Translations of the text becomes a major issue, and I'm going backwards here so you understand what we're actually looking at here. We are looking at a major problem with the actual text because, with the actual translations. For example, some such as that use the Living Bible, a translation that was popular in the early 70s, are paraphrased versions. Modern translation, which includes the New International Version and the New American Standard Versions, also try to live up to its time. Because few Christians can read the original Greek text, they're forced to trust the translators. But always the Greek text of the New Testament is translated often has an impact on theology. Not only that, depending on the text that was used to do the translation, whether it was the Textus Receptus or the Textus Sinaiticus, and we're going to see some other texts, or even, for example, this text that I mentioned earlier today, the Shem Tov, or the Tudelit, or a whole bunch of other manuscripts that now they're trying to utilize it to bring it close to some form of Hebraism or modern Hebraism to try to get an idea of the historical Jesus. To see how this works, let's compare some English translations so we can start with Matthew 5 verse 17, a saying that Jesus is also given in the Talmud. I've come not to destroy the law of Moses, nor to add to the law of Moses. Interesting enough, this statement is also made in reference in the Talmud, Babylonia, Shabbat 116b. And obviously it has a level of authenticity here, because we see it in more than one source being utilized that this was actually something that Jesus said. The meaning here is very clear. Jesus did not come to alter the Holy Scriptures, the Torah, in any way. But the Christian interpretation, which is based on the translation as well as the Greek text, is completely different. Starting with the King James Version, which was published in 1611 and has gone under various revisions, the text of Matthew 5:17 is as follows. And keep in mind, I'm utilizing an incredible book that also brings light to a lot of this issue, which was a book written by a good friend of mine who is a former Baptist Christian, and he wrote a book called The Noahide Guide to Matthew. And I do recommend it. If you want a copy, just contact me and I'll put you in contact with him. His name is Alan Cecil, incredible genius who also learned, and he could also help you regarding this area. Now it says very clearly in his page 17, it says, "Think not that I come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill." Here the translation shows no difference between the Talmudic Aramaic and the New Testament Greek. In the Christian version, Jesus does not say that he is not to add to the law, but to fulfill or to perform. It has more or less the same meaning as the Talmudic version. Jesus did not come to change the law. Here's another translation taken from the popular New International Version. "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill." Now notice the key word, to fulfill them. Fulfill what? To fulfill the law, which meant that his initial intention was to keep the commandments, to put it into practice. As we can see, although the wording is slightly different, the meaning is more or less the same as the King James Version. There are other translations that are popular with the public, but these translations are more highly paraphrased. The next example is from the Living Bible, a late 20th century translation. "Don't misunderstand why I have come. I did not come to abolish the law of Moses or the writings of the prophets. No, I came to accomplish their purpose." Another translation, the New Life Version, is even more paraphrased. "Do not think that I have come to do away with the law of Moses or the writings of the earlier preachers. I have not come to do away with them, but to complete them." Now, here's where we get into a lot of trouble, and it's the application of the interpretation of what was actually said. And here is where we have the theological swing by the translations. Notice that the version describes the Hebrew prophets as earlier preachers, giving a Christian twist to the text. And it's more explicit, it's giving also a theological interpretation to completing the law. In other words, where it comes out that now the picture is not that Jesus had to keep the law and keep the commandments, but in fact that Jesus had to do that in order to fulfill it for everybody else. This changes the whole notion of what was actually said. Many Christians understand these are merely translations, and the interpretation of Greek text depends on the skill and theology of the interpreter. What most Christians do not realize, and for that matter pastors, is that the ancient Greek texts used to translate the English New Testament are themselves as different as the examples given above. Here's an example of the King James versions of Matthew chapter 24, verse 36. "But of the day and the hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only." This verse comes from chapter 24, in which Jesus discusses the future events, eschatology, and that he states that the hour of redemption is known to neither man nor angel, but only to God. Nor now he compares this verse with other translations. Now notice this. Let's do this. Now no one, this is the New International Version, "No one knows about the day or the hour, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son." Notice that addition. "Nor the Son, but only the Father." New American Standard Version reads, "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angel of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone." Now, the New Living Translation, New Life Version says the following. "But no one knows the day or the hour. No, not even the angels in heaven. Not even they know. The Son does not know. Only the Father knows." New Life Version. "However, no one knows the day or hour when these things will happen, not even the angels in heaven or the Son himself. Only the Father knows." Now that one is the New Living Translations. These other verses are basically the same, with one important difference. The underlined words that I just mentioned, "nor the Son," are not found in the King James Version. This is an important theological omission, for it implies that even Jesus himself does not know the exact hour of the events that even he had been speaking to the apostles about. The phrase "nor the Son" is found in the earlier Greek text, but in the later text it has been deliberately removed out. So my questions to the Christian theologians and to the Christian pastors: why was it found in the earlier text and then removed deliberately out, as if to imply, how can a man who is stated to be God not know when things are going to happen in the future? Here is another verse that obviously tells us that he's not the same as God the Father. Here's another verse, one that is more of theological importance. This one is from the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6, verse 13. This is the final verse of the Lord's Prayer, which is arguably the most important prayer in Christianity. This is the King James Version. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever. Amen. We've all heard that. The Christian world has all heard this repeatedly over. However, another translation from the Amplified Bible has its slightly different wording. And bring us not into temptation, in parentheses, but deliver. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil, the evil one. For yours is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever. Amen. But compare these two with the modern translations. The New International Version. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. Do not bring us to the time of trial, but rescue us from the evil one. That's the New Revised Standard Version. Both of these translations leaves out the word, for thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever. Amen. Why would the translators leave out an entire sentence of the most famous prayer in the New Testament, a prayer that Jesus transmitted to his disciples? If this was a prayer that Jesus himself taught, and since Christians consider Jesus to be God incarnate, is this not tantamount to editing God's own holy words? Let's look for two more examples. The first is Matthew 18, verse 11. For the Son of Man is come to save that which was lost. That's the King James Version. Now, the New American Standard Version says that for the Son of Man has come to save that which was lost. The New Life Version reads, for the Son of Man has come to save that which was lost. This is another famous saying of Jesus, and the meaning of all these three verses is identical. In fact, the New American Standard Bible and the New Life versions are exactly the same. And here is a version that is not only more paraphrased, but has a theological comment included. For the Son of Man came to save, now this is from the Amplified Bible, for the Son of Man came to save from the penalty of eternal death, in parentheses, that which was lost. That's the Amplified Version. Even with a theological inclusion, the meaning is more or less the same as the examples of Matthew 18, verse 11. If we compare the translations to the modern translations, such as the New International Version or the New Revised Standard Version, we notice that the verse does not exist in these two translations. The text of Matthew 18 has a verse 10 and a verse 12, but no verse 11. And the entire verse, one of Jesus' most famous saying, is not found in the text of the earlier manuscripts. One last example that Alan Cecil gives us is found in Matthew 23, verse 14. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. Therefore ye shall receive greater damnation. Now that's the old King James Version. Now let's look at the Amplified Bible. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, pretenders, hypocrites, in parentheses, for you swallow up widow houses, and for a pretense to cover it up make long prayers. Therefore you will receive greater condemnation and heavier sentence. Amplified Bible. Now let's take a look at the New Life Version. It is bad for you, teachers of the law and proud religious law-keepers, you who pretend to be someone you are not. You take houses from poor women whose husbands died. Then you try to cover it up by making long prayers. You will be punished all the more because of this. New Life Version. In the New International Version, the Revised Standard Version, the New Revised Standard Version, the verse, like Matthew chapter 18, verse 11, does not exist. It has been left out, deleted, excised. And thus we have many examples like this, not just in the Gospel of Matthew, but throughout the whole entire New Testament. And most Christians, pastors even, I would dare say, even doctors in theology, are unaware of these differences. And many either do not know why the translators would leave them out, why would they leave these important verses out, or why would they insert phrases or would cause theological problems, such as nor the Son in the phrase in chapter 24, verse 36 of Matthew. What needs to be pointed out here is that these differences have nothing to do with translations. They represent differences in the Greek text themselves. If the difference in translations from the Greek have an impact on how the New Testament is read, think about the implications of using different Greek texts that they themselves have different wordings. How much more so if we change it to Aramaic, Syriac, or other languages, and assume that they're more original or more antiquated or more ancient in dating than the most earlier datings of the Greek manuscripts. So this presents a major problem in translations. Now these are all translations that you all know about, but way before all of these more modern translations, such as the Greek New Testament, such as the ones that we just mentioned here, there were other translations being done way in the early part of the 3rd to 4th century, which was still alive, the idea of spreading the message. And this becomes a major problem as we begin to realize that the versions or the translations of the New Testament were various. For example, scholars have distinguished 5 different Syriac translations of all or part of the New Testament. They are the Old Syriac, the Peshitta or the Common Version, the Philioxenian, the Heraclean, and the Palestinian Syriac version. And all of these versions are not original. They're just a translation of something that they based themselves off to write off. Now the Old Syriac version, for example, of the 4 Gospels is preserved today in 2 manuscripts, both of which have large gaps in them, and they both have parchment manuscripts in the British Museum, the same museum that holds the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. And there's a beautiful Estrangla hand, and all of this is in if you go and purchase Bruce Metzger books, there's plates and pictures of these manuscripts. Incredible work Professor Metzger has done on this. And I recommend those of you who are truly interested in learning the truth about the Gospel of Matthew to start acquiring a nice library about these manuscripts and start realizing it's not what they sold you. But let's continue. The Old Syriac version of Acts and the epistles of Paul has not survived in extenso. And in these cases we also have an Ephraim text of the Pauline epistles, which was reconstructed. Now that word, whenever you hear that word reconstruction, I want to pose a big warning, because the word reconstruction means that someone took and pieced together the pieces. The best way I can describe a reconstruction of anything is if you take a glass and you dash it on the floor and it's all these small pieces and you're trying to put the pieces together and you're trying to understand what the actual storyline or story or words were actually said. Eventually you're going to realize there's going to be some major missing gashes when you put all these pieces together, because there's some parts that completely were destroyed. And when we talk about reconstruction, this is exactly what we're referring to. It's never the same as the original copy. And so the Ephraim text of Pauline epistles was reconstructed by a gentleman named Joseph Molitor, and that you'll have in the Momenta Biblica et Ecclesiastica in Rome, volume 4. And thus you have a whole list of manuscripts that are out there, and each manuscript, or you rather said translation, doesn't match another translation. They're all different readings, and they're not consistent. This is some of the problems that we're going to be encountering as we delve in there. The Peshitta version, or the Syriac Vulgate of the New Testament, was prepared about the 5th century, probably in the Old Supplement version, competing with the Old Syriac translation. So anyone really doing some study would need to also compare the Syriac version of these manuscripts to see some of the earlier, more modern one of the 15th century, which is what the Textus Receptus was really all about. Because the Peshitta was accepted as a standard version of the scriptures for both the eastern and western branches of Syrian Christendom. And one must conclude that it had attained some degree of status prior to the split of the Syrian church in the year 431 of the Common Era. More than 350 manuscripts of the Peshitta New Testaments are known today, several which dates from the 5th to 6th century. The text of Peshitta had been transmitted with remarkable fidelity. Transmitted. Not that there's not any errors in it, but they've been transmitted, copied pretty well. So far, the significant variant exists among the witnesses. The textual complexion, says Bruce Metzger, of the Peshitta version has not yet been satisfactorily investigated, but apparently it represents the work of several hands in various parts, including a closer type of the Byzantine type of the text of Acts and so forth. Now you also have another Syrian type of version called the Philoxenian or Heraclean version, and these are all translations of the Syriac. And these are translations. Please keep this in mind. These are like what you have in the King James Version, but in Syriac. Different forms of Syriac. And the Syriac version produced in the year 508 for Philoxenos and the Bishop of Marburg by Polycarp and his Correspuscus was reissued in the year 613 by Thomas of Harkel. He was a bishop of 2 or 3 Greek manuscripts. On the other hand, it has been held that the Philoxenian version was revised by Thomas, who had in the margin certain readings which he considered to be important but not worthy of inclusion in the text. In other words, according to the first view, there is but one version which was republished with variant readings noted in the margin. Notice they put their little notes that this should be read this way versus this other way. And there are 2 separate versions entirely. The later one being provided with a marginalized reference. Also, the Heraclean apparatus of Acts is the second most important witness to the Western text, being surpassed in this respect only by the Codex Bezae. Now, the Palestinian Syriac version is a translation into the Christian Palestinian Syriac or Aramaic. It's known chiefly from the lectionary of the Gospel preserved in these 3 manuscripts dating from the 11th and 12th century. So although this version is much more of earlier dating, in addition to the fragments of the Gospels and continuous text, they are extant, and I have a whole bunch of scraps of the Acts together with several of the Pauline epistles. And when this is noted in a lot of the work of theological work or works, usually they abbreviate this manuscript as SYR for Syriac, PA for Palestinian in the above corner, which has made much dispute, most because scholars think it was dated about the 5th century and apparently is based on a Greek text. I want you to hear this. It's based upon a Greek text of Caesarian or Caesarian type. This is quite independent from other Syriac versions, says Bruce Metzger. Now you also have a Latin translation, which was highly used by the Catholic Church and by Rome and by North Africa, and this is why even to the West, the Catholic version became the Latin version became the Latin Vulgate and the primary Latin that was utilized in most of this. It was there that most attempts were made to translate the Bible into Latin, and it had been much disputed. The opinion of most scholars today is that the Gospel were first rendered into Latin during the last quarter or 2nd century in North Africa, where the Carthage had become enamored by the Roman culture. Not long afterwards, the translations were made into Italy, Gaul, and elsewhere. The wooden literalistic characteristic of style These renderings suggest that the early copies were made in some form of a interlinear rendering of the Greek. You can compare that to in the more modern Greek lettering. Now, the Old Latin version, which was during the 3rd and Old Century versions, circulated already in North Africa, and a lot of these copies were rendering the same verses as Luke chapter 24, verse 4 to 5, and you have pieces and parts of the different Gospels, not complete parts. Interesting enough that the Old Latin manuscript that had survived bears out Jerome's complaint to Pope Damasus that there were almost as many versions as manuscripts. As it says in his writing to St. Jerome in his preface in Novum Opus to his translation of the 4 Gospels, Dot enim sunt exemplaria panecot codice. No codex of the entire Old Latin Bible is extant. The Gospels are represented by about 32 mutilated manuscripts. And I want to say that again. 32 mutilated manuscripts, besides the numbers of fragments. About a dozen manuscripts of Acts are extant. There are 4 manuscripts and several fragments of Pauline epistles, but only 1 complete manuscript and several fragments of Apocalypse. Let me say that again. Various fragments of Apocalypse. These witnesses date from the 4th century to the 3rd century, thus proving that the Old Latin version was still copied long after it had gone out of its general use. The Old Latin manuscripts are designed in a critical apparatus by small letters of the Latin alphabet. The textual complication or complexion of the Old Latin version is typically Western. The most significant and important witness of the Old Latin versions are the following, the group according to the African European type text. The African Old Latin manuscripts called the Codex Palatinus, designated by the symbol of the letter E in the 5th century manuscript containing portions of the 4 Gospels, and they were written in silver ink or purple parchment. Though the type of text in the E manuscript is basically African. It's strongly Europeanized, and Augustine probably employed a gospel text of this kind before the year 400 of the Common Era. The symbol H is given to fragmentary manuscripts of this type in the 6th century manuscript known as the Fleury Palimpsest, which contains about 1/4 of Acts, besides portions of the Catholic epistles and the book of Revelation. The manuscript contains many scribal errors. Let me say this again. If you can hear this again and over again and over again, it's very worthwhile to listen to it. Many, and this is Bruce Metzger, many scribal errors. Rendering into Latin is often very free. There's this very, very paraphrasing. For example, the narrative of Paul's voyage in Acts appears to be a corrupt form of the abridgment made by the translator, the one translating from another copy into his language. The most important witness of the African Old Latin Codex is the Biennisis, which is also symboled with the letter K, which has been assigned. Unfortunately, it's quite fragmentary and contains only about a half of Matthew and Mark. It's copied around the year 400 of the Common Era in Africa, and was brought to the Irish monastery of Bobbio in northern Italy, and it was preserved for many centuries until it found a home in the National Library at Turin, where it is currently at today. It's a form of text that agrees closely with quotations made by Cyprian of Carthage in the year 250 of the Common Era, and according to Lowe, it shows paleographical marks of having been copied from a 2nd century papyrus. It's noteworthy that K contains immediate ending of the Gospel according to Mark, and this becomes important because here you have an ancient text where the whole entire resurrection story is not even at all mentioned, which means that was later added into the other translations of the Christian New Testament in order to somehow explain what happened after the death, which brings a lot of people into question whether in fact he really survived the death situation or not. Whether it was a resurrection or a resuscitation, whole completely different concept. But these are questions and issues that when you start studying the manuscript, you begin to have to ask, because they have theological implications to anyone who wishes to study this. Obviously, it's better to be spoon-fed than to actually do the homework and look into an actual study of these different passages that you're relying your whole entire eternal life on. And this is why this whole entire study on the Gospel of Matthew, we're presenting it now in English, because I think we need to ask serious questions. What are you relying your whole entire future, present, and past on? It's a major issue here, my friends. How did Mark end this gospel? Unfortunately, it seems to indicate that the last 12 verses are lacking in two of the earliest manuscripts, including the Old Latin manuscripts, the one I just mentioned, the Sinaitic Syriac, and many other old Armenian versions. In other words, it would seem to indicate that Mark is missing the whole story from verse 9 through 20 about the resurrection. My friend, this is a big hole. Of course, that hole was filled when smart scribes of the church decided to fill in the gap and somehow tried to harmonize what was there in a very, very innovative way. Okay, let's go on and continue forward. The old European Latin manuscripts, which was the oldest European manuscripts in the Gospel, is the Codex Vercellianus, also known with a symbol of the manuscript with the letter A, small a, kept in the cathedral treasure room of Versailles in northern Italy. According to an old tradition, it was written by hand by Eusebius, the bishop of Versailles, who was martyred in the year 370 of the Common Era. Next to the K is the most important old Latin manuscripts of the Gospel. The Codex Veronensis is in possession of the chapter of library of the Cathedral at Verona in Italy. It's a purple parchment manuscript written in the 5th century with silver and occasionally gold ink. It contains the 4 Gospels almost in their entirety. The order of Matthew, John, Luke, and Mark, according to Burkitt's opinion, represents a type of text which Jerome used as the basis of the Vulgate. Codex Colbertinus was written in the 12th century, much earlier, in the southern France, and is now in the Bibliothèque Nationale at Paris, and contains the 4 Gospels in a mixed form of text. Clear traces of African readings persist throughout the whole text. You also have the Latin side of the 5th and 6th century. The Codex Corbinus multiplied copy of the 4 Gospels. You also have the symbol M, the Codex Gigas, which is an importance for textual critics because the book of Acts and the book of Revelation preserves an old form of the Latin text, which agrees with the scriptural quotation made by Lucifer of Cagliari in Sardinia. This was about the 4th century. So imagine the church having a leader by the name of Lucifer. It's a little joke there. The symbol is used to refer to a patristic collection of biblical passages arranged by topics to illustrate special points of conduct. This was a special volume called a speculum, the Latin meaning mirror. It reflected the conduct to preserve the number of manuscripts. And this is used when they identify the manuscript with a lost small little m. There are different editions. The Latin Vulgate, of course, became the most popular one towards the close of the 4th century, with limitations and perfections of the Old Latin. Became evident to the leaders of the Roman Church that it's not surprising that in the year 382 of the Common Era, Pope Damasus requested the most capable Bible scholars then living, Sophronius Eusebius, known today as Saint Jerome, to undertake a revision of the Latin Bible. So here we have the Latin Vulgate is a revision. In other words, a better worked up translation. And here we have another issue of new changes or New Testament coming abroad, authorized by the church. When and how, through Jerome's revised, the rest of the New Testament has been much debated by several scholars, including Brun, Cavallera, Fisher, and have argued that Jerome had nothing to do with the making of the Vulgate text of the rest of the New Testament, but that by curious twist of literary history, the work of some other translators came to be circulated as Jerome work, which, by the way, is very common, that a lot of the people took credit for the work that was actually brought together by somebody else. This common accepted view, however, rests upon the natural interpretation of what Jerome says about the work of revision. Now, all of this said, we are just beginning to cover some of the translations. You have also the Coptic version. The Coptic is the latest form of the ancient Egyptian language, which until Christian time was written in hieroglyph, and the two derivatives are Demotic script. The first century Christian era, the language became written in Greek, uncials. And we see this type of derivation. These are all translations of some other previous text. You also have the Bohairic version, or translation. You have the Gothic Translation, which often is called the Apostle to the Goth, translated the Bible from Greek into Gothic. For all your Gothic fans, this is the Bible for you. For this purpose, he created the Gothic alphabet and reduced the spoken language to written form. The Gothic version is the earliest known monument in a Germanic dialect. The most nearly completed of half a dozen extant Gothic manuscripts, all of which, here's that word again, fragmentary, which means it's not complete. It's all little pieces. It's like a little piece of the puzzle. You also have the Armenian version, sometimes called the Queen of the Versions. The Armenian version is generally regarded as one of the most beautiful and accurate of all early translations of the Bible, with the exceptions of the Latin Vulgate, of course, because Latin was authorized by Jerome, by the Church. More manuscripts of the versions are extant than any other version. Rode has cataloged more than 1,244 copies of all or part of the New Testament, and is known several hundred more in libraries within the Soviet Union. Traditions differ regarding its origin. According to Bishop Corinne, who died in 450 of the Common Era, and the historian Lazar of Farb, it was Mesrob who was the one who made this copy, who died in the year 439. And soldiers who became a Christian missionary who created a new alphabet with the help of the Catholicus Sachak, or Isaac the Great. No doubt probably of Jewish origin, but let's go over there. 390 to 439. Translate the version from the Greek text. And on the other hand, Moses of Shorian, the nephew of the disciple of Mesrop, says that Sahak made it into the Syriac text. Both views, however, with various modifications, have found defenders among modern scholars. There is some reason to think that the earliest Armenian version of the Gospel circulated in the form and the harmony distantly related to the Tatian's Diastesron. The earliest Armenian version appears to have undergone a revision prior to the 8th century. Now, those of you that don't know about the Armenian tradition, one of the traditions was that the disciple Thomas Didymus had gone out to the area of Armenia and established the church. Was one of the old ancient traditions, but that's not here, not there. But whether the Greek text which was served as the basis for the revision was predominantly Caesarian or Koinoni, which is the Koinoni Greek and textual type, is a question which was not yet been answered with satisfaction. Now, we're going through all of this because we need to understand that the New King James Version is not the only version that existed. This business of doing translation has existed since the day one the church was in business. The Georgian version, all earlier versions of the New Testament, probably the least well known in the Western scholars, is this version or translation called the Georgian Translation. People of the Caucasian Georgia, again close to the Russia area, were very mountainous area, received the gospel during the first half of the 4th to 5th century. The time of circumstance of translation of the New Testament to Georgian is an agglutinative language not known to related to any other, are hidden in the mist of legends. In other words, it's hard to translate this version. Like the Armenian version, its important witness is to the Caesarian type or Caesarian type of text. Among the oldest known Gospels are the Adish manuscripts in the year 887, the Opisa manuscripts in the year 913, and the Tibet manuscripts in the year 995. Now, one of the questions you should all be asking as we're going through all this, why did they not use these manuscripts to do a translation of the New Testament, or better yet, of the Gospel of Matthew? That's a very good question, because obviously they didn't use none of that. You had the Ethiopian version, and there are answers to these rhetorical questions I'm asking. But this brings out the point. We have a major problem as we enter into the study with the Gospel of Matthew, the authenticity of Matthew. The Ethiopic version also has a lot of influence of Arabic text and Coptic text mixed into it in the later combinations. You also have other versions which takes place as subsequent to the rise of Islam. Such various books of the New Testament were translated into Arabic, from Greek and Syriac to Coptic, and several of those dialects. Latin from these combinations. Now I want you to understand, as we start translating from one version to another, as a translator, I work in the area of translation in other fields. One of the things you always are involved is the idiosyncrasy of the people that you're speaking to. Even within Spanish language, you may be saying a word in Spanish that could be offensive to another group of Hispanics or Latin American. So when you write, you have to be cognizant of this. And of course, these writers weren't always cognizant. They were writing from what they knew how to say such words. So this bears in mind a lot of the local idiosyncrasies and milieu of their own local culture as they were translating it and putting into their own words how they were able to translate the message. Then you also had patristic quotations from the New Testament, which contained several words of the New Testament, and these follow more important church fathers, which contained some of them, like Ambrose of Milan, Ambrosiatio of Rome. You had also the Bishop of Alexandria, Athanasius. You had the Bishop of Augustine, and you had that Jew lover named Chrysostom, the Bishop of Hippo, of Constantinople, and you have Clement of Alexandria. You have the Bishop of Carthage, Cyprian. You had the Cyril of Alexandria, Didymus, which is also Thomas, of Alexandria, Ephraim the Syrian, Epiphanius, the Bishop of Salamis, Eusebius, the Bishop of Caesarea, Gregory of Nazin Zeus in Cappadocia. You also have Gregory of Nyssa in Cappadocia, Heliopoeter, Hippolytus of Rome, Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon, Isidore of Pelusium, Jerome, famous Jerome, Saint Jerome, Lucifer of Colerius. I wonder why nobody writes anything about him. Marcion, who flourished at Rome, a very big anti-Semite as well. Origen of Alexandria, Pelagius of the 4th century, Primasius Bishop, Pseudo-Hieronymus the 5th and the 6th century, Rufinus of Achaia, Tertullian of Carthage, Theodore of Mosopia and Cilicia. And that is just the beginning, my friends. And we're not even finished with the whole entire textual criticism of Matthew. This is only the start. This is part 2. There's another part. Because in 1948, in 1954, we get the 1514 we get the Greek New Testament, which came into press. And here we look at the pre-critical period of the origin and the dominance, my friends, of the Textus Receptus, which becomes the cause to a lot of the problems that today Christians have. Because now we realize there are more manuscripts much older than that one, and the one we have today does not at all make sense. Well, I'm going to let you go right now, and hopefully we were able to share a little bit about the introduction, part 2 of the Gospel of Matthew. Look forward to hearing from you soon, and remember, be part. Let other people, let other pastors, other Christians, other Messianic leaders be part of the study. Send me your questions right now online, live, and that way we could respond as well. I wish you and yours a lot of blessing, and may your knowledge increase as to what Torah talks about. Shalom, shalom.